The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Cedar.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, February 21st, 2019. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Kathleen Belew, assistant professor of history, U.S. history at the University of Chicago, author of Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement in Paramilitary America. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you may not know it, but we have a bit of a problem in this country with extremist white supremacists. It's actually a really heartwarming story of different white supremacy groups that put down their differences and came together and created a whole new movement in the 80s.
It's a lesson for all of us there.
What a special time, the 80s, right? How much, let's say almost every horror that we now deal with in some way was a function of, maybe that's an exaggeration, but 80s, tough year for American politics. 90s, not that great. The aughts, I guess, not so sweet. All right. Well, nevertheless, fascinating. I actually had a joke. I don't know. Maybe this is not appropriate. We're on vacation right now, so I can tell this joke. Let's see. Cut that music a little bit on there. The joke was back when I was a stand. This is an early stand-up joke for me. In fact, I think they were all early. They were all not so great. But the joke was something to the effect of I guess I was doing a character. I guess it was actually. It must have been during the early '90s when. Oh, it's interesting. It hadn't occurred to me, but maybe this was a function of this, of what she's talking about. I was aware that there was a rise in the number of white hate groups. And the joke was something to the effect of I used to be a member of the, New White Liberation Front, but I left them to join the Free White Power Front. The New White Liberation Front just had a, bad dental plan. I was trying to figure out why, and they didn't, they were a little chintzy on the picnics. I was trying to figure out why you would create new white hate groups. Oh, and the other one was the New White Liberation Front didn't hate Puerto Ricans enough. That was basically the joke. But I guess actually it occurs to me now in retrospect, there was a dynamic that was going on that was real. And Kathleen Belew has written about it, the White Power Movement in Paramilitary America. Folks, if you're a member, you'll have access to the deep archive pick that Brendan has pulled out for you today. If you're not a member, you can do so by becoming a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. It is your support that makes this show possible. Quick break, and then right back with Bring the War Home, the White Power Movement, and the Paramilitary America, Kathleen Belew. We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report. On the phone, it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Assistant Professor of U.S. History at University of Chicago and author of Bring the War Home, the White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, Kathleen Belew. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, let's start. I want to start in 1979 in Greensboro, North Carolina. and then I want to go backwards, to maybe a little bit before where the main thesis of your book lies, but just so that we get a sense of the sort of disparate, factions, elements, movements that make up organized racism, I guess, in the country. I don't know how else to say that, but tell us about this event in Greensboro, North Carolina, in 1979, because I don't think it really remains in the popular consciousness very much.
You're right. I think it's a great place to start, too, because I think that the Greensboro shooting, which I'll describe in a moment, is important both because it represents the formal beginning of what I would call the white power movement, which is an alliance between different elements of white supremacist and far-right groups that had before that been disparate. So I'm talking about Klansmen and neo-Nazis, radical tax protesters, later racist skinhead groups, and others who are kind of brought into this wide, broad-based social movement that I think is best thought of as the white power movement. So Greensboro is also important because it is the closest historical cognate to a lot of what has brought this movement back into our public discourse. So, for instance, when we think about the altercations in Charlottesville, Virginia, that garnered headlines very recently, the clearest historical cognate event is Greensboro. So what happened is on November 3rd, 1979, a organized group of white power gunmen, including both Klansmen and neo-Nazis, opened fire on a leftist Death to the Klan march in Greensboro. They killed 5 people, including 4 white men and 1 African-American woman, and also injured several other people. And they immediately escaped the scene. Police were not on the scene. And in 3 subsequent trials, the judicial system kind of broadly failed to do anything meaningful about that violence.
Wow. Okay, so we have that event and this notion of the white power movement essentially being an umbrella movement, I guess, for these disparate groups of I guess white supremacists. How would you? Because I guess we think about in a non-academic sense. When I say white power, I think, oh yeah, of course, we've had white power movements throughout, since Reconstruction, I guess. Maybe before then too, but ones that were sort of like a little bit less supported by the structure of society on some level. But give us a history in the context of your thesis that much of these more militant versions of white supremacy are a function, or at least in some way a function, of our foreign policy.
Sure. Let me circle back around to war and foreign policy at the end of my answer, because I do think it's a good idea to stop for a minute and think about terminology. I think you're right that what we call these groups and how we think about them is load-bearing in the sense that it really shapes the kinds of response that are then available, both within public discourse and in other ways. So let me just start with the term white supremacist. The people that I write about definitely are white supremacists in the sense that they believe white people are superior. Many of them also believe that white people are in fact the only humans and that other people are either descended from animals or from Satan when it's a long story, but that is a belief that comes from the political theology called Christian identity. There's a lot of other kinds of dehumanizing ways that they think about Jewish people and people of color. But the thing about white supremacist as a terminology is that much of American society is white supremacist, especially in the period of my study. But going into the present, there's a lot of structures in our society that have been described as white supremacist by historians and legal scholars. There's a lot of white supremacy that does not go so far as my actors. The other one that comes up a lot that's been in all the Twitter feeds today is nationalist or white nationalist. And that's probably more correct for the people that I'm writing about, in the sense that from a political science definition, they are white nationalists. They're advocating for the identity and strength and preservation of a nation. The place that this gets tricky is that after 1983, the people I'm writing about don't think about that nation as the United States. There's kind of an implication when we talk about white nationalism that it's like an overexertion of patriotism, right? And you might think about the first KKK marching on the National Mall in Washington, wearing their robes and hoods, but with their faces plainly in view. That's not what this is. After 1983, the nation that is imagined by white nationalism is the Aryan Nation. They're thinking about a transnational group of white people and how they can seize terrain, militarily defend, and vanquish others. That's not about patriotism. That is about a direct threat to the nation of the United States. So the white power movement, I think, is a better name for this, because it is more radical, and it is also, I mean, not for nothing, what a lot of these activists called themselves.
Right.
But it also returns us to this other question about the impact of foreign policy and war upon racist mobilizations and vigilante violence mobilizations in the United States. Because,
let me just pause. Let me just ask you to pause just right there. Sure. I want to circle back to that, but I just want to clear up the nationalism question a little bit, because it is every day on this show we hear someone arguing about obviously the president too, right? I mean, how much of that stuff, and I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but obviously we'll get back to the thesis, which I gotta say I think is fascinating. But this concept of the nationalism that we're talking about, particularly after the early '80s, is of a non-existent or a sort of almost a civilization of people, but white people. And it does not necessarily have specific national boundaries per se, right. But they have a vision of, finding they're in exile on some level, and they're in the diaspora, I guess, and they're looking for their country. But how much of that, like when we hear civic nationalists versus white nationalists versus nationalists, how much of that is we're just trying to hide the ball?
I think that is a question that has gotten very complex in our current political moment. And as a historian, what I want to try to do is look at what we can learn from the past. Okay. I think that white nationalism, which is what I'm writing about, is very clearly this anti-state impulse in the period of my study. It is very clearly a group of people who see their racial identity as far more important than their national identity, and are therefore attempting to create race war and overthrow the government in order to further the good of the race. And it's not just through race war. They do this through all kinds of ways. And I mean, one way to really think about this vividly is, I think the group that many people are familiar with is Aryan Nation, which is the compound in Idaho where a lot of these groups meet up in the summer, and also is its own community. Aryan Nations means transnational white group, a transnational nation of white people. That's what that means. And their intention is to connect with people in Canada, in South Africa, in Europe, and Australia in order to create a white world. Now, how they get there is a sort of feat of imagination, especially given that they're confronting the most militant superstate in world history. But they do this through everything from migration and campaigns to have more white babies and drives to, support those white children and white families, all the way up through race war. This is a broad-based social movement around not only white identity or kind of the role of whiteness in American life, which is, of course, something we could talk more about, but it's about this very radical approach to attempting to unseat the nation.
Okay, so
sorry, that's very unclear. I mean, unseat the federal government.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And I respect that it's
from that,
with outside of your portfolio, and we may have to wait 20 years to ask you that question about this moment in terms of the way that nationalism is being used. All right, but let's go back to that concept of how our foreign entanglements bring, I guess. Part of the returns of that are the increased militancy amongst white power folks.
Yeah, and this is another place where the term white power can be instructive to us, because actually the corollary term is probably black power. We have a lot of historical work about how Vietnam veterans coming back impacted leftist mobilizations, not only after Vietnam, but through American history. And it turns out that the same thing is true on the right. We see upsurges in vigilante violence and in these kinds of group formations, not only after the Vietnam War, but after every major war in American history. So when I set out to write this project, I was wondering if I might find something like a Rambo story, simply a return story about disaffected veterans wreaking violence after homecoming. It turns out it is not at all that simple, and that what's happening is both sort of a very small but instrumental number of veterans who do share military skills and strategies after homecoming, meeting a whole bunch of civilians who are also militarized by the project of warfare. Those rises in violence appear across all strata of American society after warfare. So it's not just men, it's not just the age group of people who have served in combat, but all American civilians get more violent after warfare. That violence is then mobilized by this kind of political formation, and in the period of my study has some very specific ways that it's shaped by the Vietnam War.
Okay, and before we just get to the Vietnam War, we can see examples of this in following World War I. We see a rise in the Klan in the 1920s. We have talked about at least that rise on this program with several authors, but that's a specific time for that rise, right? I mean, it's not. Are there other factors that play into it there? Because I mean, clearly, we're post Reconstruction, we can see that pushback, but we're still 20 years out from that. And when we see this rise, and I think it was something like at that point 6 million card-carrying members, essentially, of the Klan in this country. That's a lot of people at a time when I think the population was 100 million in the country.
Yeah, it's a huge number of people, and so part of the thing to understand about the Klan is that we're rarely talking about a centralized organization or about a completely coherent single group. It is often a constellation of local groups. So when I talk about these major membership surges, you can see that one way to see, so of course there are other factors that push and pull these memberships up and down, right? But when we think about other factors, for instance, economic stress or immigration or racial animus, nothing aligns quite as neatly as the aftermath of combat with those major membership surges. So while those factors do matter, they play a major role, I think what historians have often missed is this other element of sort of the relationship between military activity and warfare and the aftermath of that kind of violence in the domestic space. So the way I got into this project is actually from the testimony and writings of people in this movement. All through this archive, I kept encountering this idea where people would say something like, I killed communists in Vietnam, so why wouldn't I kill communists in the United States? This is a profound slippage of meaning, right? It collapses home front and battle. It collapses different kinds of communist enemies. It collapses time between peacetime and wartime. It also muddies a whole bunch of different sort of discourses, especially in regions like the South, where communism worked not only as sort of a straight up and down political signifier, but was also invoked to sort of serve as a code word for policing racial norms, for policing labor agitation, for policing interracial relationships. So all of these things get boiled down in a really interesting way to be about an extension of military service, which they're talking about as patriotic. And that sort of discursive use of the war, I think, is what I'm trying to get at in the book.
Now, and you specifically focus on the post-Vietnam era, but before we get to that specifically, to what extent does the nature of the military escapade, as it were, impact the nature of that that blowback that comes back to the States? Because I mean, I know that part of it is, Vietnam is at least within the 20th century, the experience of Vietnam and the experience of vets when they returned was somewhat unique in terms of the way that we perceived ourselves. Maybe, the actual battle itself, I'm sure, was, equally horrific. But there was a difference in sort of the I guess, qualitatively of the experience of the United States in that war. How much does that implicate
Absolutely.
What comes back?
Well, it's enormous. And I think that, so I think the Vietnam War in particular does several different things. First of all, it makes possible the unification of different ideologies on the right. So Klansmen and neo-Nazis before the Vietnam War have a really difficult time getting in the same room and sort of sharing resources and creating friendships with each other because of the legacy of World War II still being such a huge shaping factor. So Klansmen who see themselves as patriotic don't want to align with Nazism because a lot of them fought Nazism in World War II. After Vietnam, there's this whole new narrative that can bring people together in a shared struggle against the government. And part of that is made possible, too, by the way that not just people in this fringe movement, but many people felt betrayed by the government during Vietnam, partly because of the way the war was waged, partly because of the failure of the nation to sort of respond to veterans as they came home in ways that were sensitive and were meeting people's needs, and partly because of the way that both of those things were narrativized by the political right after the war was over. The other thing that the Vietnam War does that's different than these earlier surges is to dramatically escalate the kind of strategies and weapons such that the civilian casualties are just astronomically higher. And of course, my book concludes with the largest of these, which is the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which killed 168 people, including 19 young children. The scale of that violence is much different than, say, the scale of the violence of Klansmen who were confronting civil rights protesters in the 50s and 60s. So part of that is because of the tactics and strategies of the Vietnam War. And here I'm thinking of plastic explosives like C4, but in other places, the people in my book are trying to use things like anti-tank weapons and automatic rifles and semi-automatics and military-grade machine guns and surface-to-air missiles and a whole bunch of other technology that is from Vietnam in order to escalate the impact of what they're able to do. So, and when civilians are in the crosshairs, this is very, very concerning.
So if I understand you, the difference between, say, the rise of the Klan in the 20s and the rise of white power, in the 70s and into the early 80s, as a blowback to Vietnam, is in part when the Klan came back, I mean, part of it is that you're militarized, I guess, and so the idea of coming back and sort of organizing and being, having some measure of violence for a narrow set of people, but also the society, broadly speaking, is more, I guess, amenable to sort of militarization because everybody's been on a war footing, as it were. The big difference is that after Vietnam, there's a certain amount of disillusionment. And in addition to the distance that we have that was, keeping neo-Nazis and Klansmen apart, there is this sense of like giving up on the U.S. government and a more space to imagine a white nation.
Exactly, and part of it is that the war comes home, and so the war that these activists are trying to wage reflects the Vietnam War in its shape and symbols and tactics. And part of it is that after 1983, this whole movement is calibrated at overthrowing, subverting, and unseating the federal government. So the Klan in the 20s is, in many places, indistinguishable from the state. So if you think
many
about
of them
Indiana,
were local officials. I mean, many of them were government officials.
Many of them,
and
yeah, we're talking about like
even.
10% of the state of Indiana was in the Klan, and a ton of elected officials. And as I said before, they were marching openly on the mall. They did church picnics. It was a very mainline and
civic organization, almost.
Civic organization, yeah. And I mean, when I teach this to my undergraduates, part of what I always try to underline is how much people in the time of the Second Klan were just interested in joining stuff. So the founder of the Second Klan was also in like the Masons, the Odd Fellows, the Knights Templar, and I think the Pythians, and also in 3 different churches. I mean, like he just liked to be in clubs, and that current of sort of what was popular runs through all of the Second Klan. The 80s Klan is oriented towards 80s pop culture, what it is to be cool and appealing. So they're into paramilitary training camps and camouflage and armament. And that's also sort of how the Vietnam War shaped broader society. But this revolutionary turn is very significant because it's not anymore about vigilante violence in which the Klan is sort of working to support status quo power or to support the state. They're aimed at a full-scale overthrow of the federal government. And as I said, this is an imaginative feat because of sort of the impossibility of the task. One important movement book, the Turner Diaries, calls this, they say it's like trying to assassinate an elephant with a gnat, right? It's about a totally asymmetric project of trying to unseat the government. And how they imagine this will be possible is part of what I'm trying to document in the book as well.
And how much, and you mentioned that the sort of the technological advances, carried over too. How much was the nature of Vietnam in that the civilian population was perceived to be an enemy in a way that in World War II, in World War I, and even I think in the Korean War, there was a sense that, to the extent that U.S. soldiers are there, they're there to liberate, and they and certainly in World War II, it's other white people to a large extent. How much did those play into it, and also the idea that we lost Vietnam, or at least there was, there was a perception that we lost as we left. How much did that also play into it?
I think all of that is important. And let me just quickly say that what I'm saying about the Vietnam War here is going to be about the way that activists in this fringe movement told the story of the war,
right.
Rather than a judgment about the war itself. Because the Vietnam War also engendered all kinds of other social movements, right? Like including libertarian leftist movements, including sort of pan-racial. I mean, many people in Vietnam tell stories about overcoming their own racial prejudice and lifelong friendships and things like this, right? And that's perhaps the more quantitative view of the Vietnam War. But if you look at the white power movement, the story that they're telling is definitely about government betrayal and loss, and about the people that they lost in combat in Vietnam, and how this shows the sort of the great wrong of the state itself. And we see the impact of that kind of discourse in events like the Klan harassment of Vietnamese fishermen in the Galveston Bay area in the early 1980s, 1979 and 1981, where Klansmen trained local white fishermen in paramilitary camps to harass Vietnamese refugees. And they do things like set on fire a boat painted USS Viet Cong, right? So they're specifically saying that these refugees represent the Viet Cong, and here they are now in America. ironically, most of these refugees are, in fact, people who had served in the South Vietnamese forces and who had been American allies and for that reason had to flee after the Americans left. But the way that the Vietnam War frames out that conflict is very, very clear. And there's one picture from this time period of a Klan rally where they burned that boat, where a man is wearing a Klan hood made out of camouflage fatigue material. So this becomes just ingrained into what they're doing from kind of the post-Vietnam moment forward.
And so you break down, essentially, there were three sort of periods for this, I guess, this movement. And that one that you're talking about is in the late 70s, early 80s, where there's this consolidation, where old prejudices between neo-Nazis and KKK folks are dispensed with. And I imagine that's also sort of generational. If I'm, 25 years old in 1979, I'm not so sensitive maybe to Nazis on some level as I would have been if I was 50, I guess, or 60 or 70 at that point.
I think that's right.
And so they're finding common cause. What else, how does that consolidation happen? And then take us into that revolutionary period, and what instigates that revolutionary period?
Yeah, and this is critically important. This is one of the things that I think history can help us to understand kind of what we're seeing in the present moment, because the revolutionary turn doesn't happen under a kind of leftist regime. The revolutionary turn comes in Reagan's second term in 1983. And it happens because people in the movement are really frustrated with what they see as a failure of electoral politics to deliver the kind of radical change that they want. It's a moment of kind of coming to terms with the idea that what they want can never be achieved by the political system, and therefore it's time to go to war. That's one half of it. The other half of it has to do with simply kind of readiness. They have, by 1983, built a series of paramilitary camps all around the country. They've been amassing weapons and materiel for this kind of a project. They have a movement. It's a fictional book, but it becomes kind of a movement lodestar of ideological organizing called the Turner Diaries that gives everyone a way of strategizing what they're doing. And then they have two huge strategic breakthroughs in 1983. One is that they begin to use early computer message boards under the name LibertyNet to disseminate both movement objectives like hit lists and assassination targets, and also movement cultural materials like personal ads. And you can tell how important this is to this movement because they, when they rob millions of dollars from armored trucks, what they do with the money is distribute it to groups all around the country so that they can buy computers, and then someone goes around training them in how to use these networks. In other words, a lot of people think of the white power movement as going online after or near the Oklahoma City bombing in the early 90s. They talk about things like Stormfront. This movement was already online in 1983-84. So they've effectively been using social network activism since, long before the beginning of Facebook.
They seem like they were part of the development of it, frankly, it sounds like.
Exactly. Exactly.
How many people are we talking about at this point?
Let me circle right back to that. The other huge breakthrough in the early 1980s is the implementation of a strategy called leaderless resistance, which is what we would now think of as cell-style terror. The idea is that you can have one or a few or even like up to 6 actors working in a cell who can carry out movement objectives without communication with movement leaderships or with other people in the movement. And this strategy is implemented actually because there's so many FBI and Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms informants that have gotten into movement circles during the civil rights period. So the idea is to fool the FBI informants and to sort of stymie court prosecution. But I think the long legacy of that strategy is that the result has been that this movement has tried very, very hard not to be understood as a movement. It's trying to disguise itself such that there's never an opportunity to organize public understanding of white power violence or public opposition because it appears as, and it continues to be portrayed as, a series of lone wolf actions. So going back to your question about how large we're talking about, this is directly related to the question of leaderless resistance because what leaderless resistance means is that you're not trying to turn out 3,000 people at a cross burning or a rally, right? What you're trying to do is locate, 6 or 12 or 45 people who are prepared to dedicate their entire life to the movement. So large numbers is actually not the goal after 1983. Nevertheless, what we're talking about is perhaps best thought of in concentric circles, right? So in the 80s, there are about 25,000 people in the inner circle. And those are people that I've just described who are dedicating their entire lives to the movement. And they really do. They homeschool their children. They marry within the movement. They often have their religious services and their marriage counseling and their rides to and from the airport. All of that stuff is within the movement. And then outside of that, there's another 150 to 175,000 people who are activists, who purchase materials, who show up at events, who do things within the movement. Outside of that, there's another circle with about 450,000 more people. Those people don't purchase the literature produced by this movement, right? Like they don't buy the Klan newspaper, but they read it regularly. And we might imagine that this goes on, right? Outside of that, there's a larger circle of people who would never read something that says like Klan newspaper, but who might regularly agree with some of the ideas that are presented in one, especially if they're brought up, in confidence or with a friend. So we see that the concentric circles sort of work both to bring people in towards the inside when they locate people that would be good operatives, and they were to disseminate ideas out into the mainstream.
It's almost like a sales funnel on some level, I guess.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So once we get past, so we're not talking about the 6 million that we were in 1920, but we're talking about a far more militant group of people who. I mean, when you say that they start using LibertyNet and put out lists of people who need to be assassinated, do we have a sense of like how many people they actually assassinated?
Sure. I mean, I get into this in the book. It's very difficult to think about a full kind of, casualty or death toll for this kind of violence because, doing the recovery work of piecing together these actions is very, very difficult. They do carry out several successful assassinations. I think the one that people have often encountered is the 1984 shooting of Alan Berg, who was a radio discussant in Denver in 1984. They assassinate various state troopers who are trying to apprehend them. They assassinate sort of enemies of the movement, people who run their mouths too much, and people like that along the way. The big one is the Oklahoma City bombing, and again, we're talking about 168 people there. Now, that number, the historical context is important because 168 people after 9/11 doesn't sound like a lot of people, but we have to remember that the Oklahoma City bombing was the largest deliberate mass casualty event on American soil between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. So it's a hugely significant event. It's a huge number of people in historical perspective. And it's still an event that we as a nation have not really sort of metabolized into our understanding of public history.
I mean, it's stunning. If we had a prorated response to Oklahoma like we did to 9/11, right? I mean, I feel like one could sit down and write a book on the implications of if we responded to that threat in the way that we responded to the 9/11 threat, or it would have been nuts. Frankly.
Indeed. And so for me, as a historian, part of the thing that I'm writing about this book is not just the existence of this movement, but sort of how we lost sight of it, because we knew about this as it was happening, right? Everything I write about in this book was covered at the time. These events appear on the front pages of major newspapers all around the country. Different beat reporters are piecing bits of it together as it's happening, which is incredibly impressive reporting. A lot of it enters public discussions, like the Greensboro acquittal is even made into although very deeply unfunny, it's made into a Saturday Night Live sketch. People are talking about this. There's footage of the Klan paramilitary camps on like the morning news magazine shows. So how did we wind up with this mass disappearance of our sort of collective knowledge of what this is? And I think it has to do with the deep failures of judicial process in the 80s that predisposed people not to investigate and not to understand these acts as part of the movement, but rather to let them stand as sort of quote unquote lone wolf violence.
But is it just judicial? I mean, because it seems to me, and this where I think that dynamic is instructive for what we see today, that not only is it judicial, but Ronald Reagan is president at that time, and my sense is, and I can't point to the specifics that maybe you can, where he has people in the Justice Department who are not quite sensitive to these issues, and I may be understating there. And I mean, we certainly saw the pushback 5 or 6 years ago when the Justice Department tried to put out a document saying we've got to watch out for groups. Ostensibly, I would imagine, we're talking about these folks, or at the very least, what they've mutated into. That there is a very strong political, not just represented by one party. I mean, I'm sitting here with a New York Times article that says a Virginia police sergeant. This is from 2 days ago. Suspended after Antifa group identifies white nationalist ties. Just even that disposition towards it, they didn't. Earlier it had said tied to white nationalists. That after Antifa ties them to white nationalists. Well, of course, Antifa is not tying them to white nationalists. They are exposing the white nationalism, right? And
that would be a documentary project, I would think.
Well,
there's several different things going on there. One of them has to do with the. And this is a very tricky thing to quantify. But, okay, so part of this is about the system not being prepared to, interested in, or capable of really reckoning with white power violence. And to change that would have to do with juror education, prosecutorial mandate. I mean, there's all kinds of levels where something would have to change to really deal with this. So, I mean, one example that comes to mind is that I document the extensive sort of theft and obtaining of stolen weapons from military posts and armories by these groups in the late 1980s. Despite that, and despite the declarations of war that many of them had signed against the federal government, many of them continued to serve as active duty personnel all the way up through the early 1990s. There wasn't a prohibition against this. So some of these things are at the level of policy or judicial decision or sort of like system level things we can change. I think there are also individual issues in terms of, politicians who are not as worried about this kind of activity as perhaps they ought to be, or people who are white supremacists themselves who rise to positions of power. I think that's part of it too. I mean, the other thing that this directs our attention towards is the multiple processes of paramilitarization that have shaped American society. So one of the events that I talk about in the book is the siege at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, where ATF snipers end up killing members of a white separatist family, the Weaver family, who are holed up at Ruby Ridge. During that siege, a group of skinheads attempt to resupply the Weaver family with weapons. And there's a photograph of an ATF agent arresting one of the skinheads down on the ground. The arresting ATF agent and the skinhead are wearing the same camouflage fatigue uniforms because the same arcs of paramilitary organizing that have rippled through the white power movement have by then also shaped civilian policing, military structures, and other components of American society. I mean, this movement is drawing people from prisons, which are also responding to state violence and perpetuating it. There's all kinds of ways that this is rippling through the late 20th century.
Fascinating. All right, well, the book is Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America. Kathleen Belew, a fascinating book and thesis, and I guess it gives us a sense of at least we can see a trajectory as to where we may be heading in the future. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.